As the temps start rising, I feel that familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or just for one season. Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen, Quince gives you luxury without the markup. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. I recently got one of the European linen tanks to be able to stay cool throughout the summer while working and looking professional. So give your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Exposure work is about encountering, facing, processing emotional and psychological experiences, physiological experiences, in such a way that you learn that your own experiencing is not a dangerous thing. So what that means is we have to visit those experiences or show up to them in some way. So we might do that through a number of different exercises, like maybe having you visit the memory of the trauma or having you go to places where triggers are eliciting the experiences that you're avoiding.
That was Dr. Robyn Walser on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. It's Debbie here. I'm bringing you a 2-part series on trauma and PTSD. In this episode, you'll hear my conversation with Dr. Robyn Walser, who is truly an expert on evidence-based treatment for PTSD. And then next week, I'll be releasing part 2, which is a conversation with Emmy Neatfeld. Emmy has a personal trauma history and has written a memoir and several articles about her experience with trauma treatment, what helped her, what didn't help her. And she's been a public critic of the very popular book, The Body Keeps the Score, and she'll share some of her thoughts about that with us. So please keep listening to the end of today's interview to hear my conversation with Jill about our experience with trauma treatments, and then stay tuned for next week's episode as well. Robyn Walser, PhD, is an internationally recognized clinical psychologist, educator, and author. She is the Director of Trauma and Life Consultation and Psychology Services, Assistant Professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and Director of Research at Bay Area Trauma Recovery Clinical Services. Dr. Walser has contributed significantly to the dissemination of acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and holds a pivotal role in implementing ACT in one of the U.S.'s largest national healthcare systems. She also works at the National Center for PTSD, where her work focus is on trauma recovery, depression, and moral injury. Dr. Walser has been leading ACT workshops around the world since 1997, and she has co-authored 9 influential books on ACT. Her newest book, a self-help book for trauma and PTSD, is called You Are Not Your Trauma, an ACT guide for healing from within. Welcome back, Robyn. I'm so happy to have you back on Psychologists Off the Clock again.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
And I will tell you and our listeners that I've checked and I looked back and you've been on 6 times before. So this is your 7th appearance on the podcast, which you have the honor of being our most frequent guest.
That's amazing. I'm honored, by the way, to be your most frequent guest and happy to be here. So supercharged about it. And that's pretty exciting. I didn't know that I had been on that many times.
Yes. Yes. I know. I was like, oh my gosh. And I think I've done all your interviews. And so I was like, oh, I didn't realize it was that many either. You know what's so interesting, Robyn, is that you have so much wisdom to share that we have talked about various topics with you, but this is the first time we've talked to you specifically about trauma and PTSD, even though this has really been your life's work. And this is something you've been doing for a long time. And I've learned so much from you about trauma because your first book, Act for PTSD, was a clinician's book. And I read it years and years ago. And it was really influential in my work on PTSD because I've trained in a few modalities for trauma and PTSD, but that book really was influential for me. And so now you have a new self-help book that's out. You Are Not Your Trauma. And we're really excited that you're here to share that. And I think this is going to be a huge contribution to people who have experienced trauma and possibly PTSD.
Yeah, no, thank you. And a shout out to my co-author, Dara Westra. She and I wrote the book together, and she and I also wrote the original book together. And so we've been doing this work for a very long time. I've been working in the field of trauma for more than 30 years now, which is a little bit shocking to me, but really excited about this new book and happy that it will be out on the shelves in midsummer. That'll be available.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, it's going to be a really wonderful resource for people and also for clinicians as well, but especially for people who maybe aren't in therapy or who are in therapy for trauma but want to supplement. And so we're going to be talking about the book today and dive into some of your thoughts on trauma and the ACT perspective and how you work with exposure from the ACT perspective. But I want to start with your title of your book because I think it's a really important concept here, which is the first part of your title is You Are Not Your Trauma. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean by that and why that's important enough to stick it right up there in front on your title?
Yeah, no, thank you. I like the question and I'm excited about that title. The main reason we did it is because we really want people who are working on recovery from trauma to recognize that the trauma does not have to define them. So in all the years that I've worked with folks who have PTSD or complex trauma or have struggled with trauma in their history, it can almost be so impactful or powerful that it feels like it defines them in some way. And so what we want to do in supporting recovery is help people to see that they are more than their traumatic experience, that their life is much more rich and textured, that trauma just might be coloring how they're seeing themselves for the time being. And the work in the book is about breaking apart that sort of color palette that's in there and reorganizing in a different way so that you can take perspective on your trauma in a way that it no longer defines you. And so you are more than your trauma. And from an acceptance and commitment therapy-based approach or ACT, we're creating a place where you can recognize and see that you are a person who's experienced trauma. And certainly there's fallout that's painful and difficult. We want to acknowledge that and validate that. And we don't want people to be consumed or defined by it. So part of our goal with the book is to help people connect to a sense of self that is more than their trauma, can recover from it in a way where they live fuller, meaning-based lives that are not defined by past experiences per se.
Yeah. We'll get into that a little bit more as we go, right? How, what are we working toward? And I think that's so important that that life can be more expansive and we don't have to be constrained by it or consumed by it. It's an experience people had, but it doesn't define them. And actually, I'm really curious your thoughts about something I've noticed in the world in general recently, which is that the word trauma is getting used a lot and it's very popular right now. You see it on social media, TikTok, that kind of thing. And on the upside, I think maybe people are talking about it in more in a way that helps people open up about it and maybe is less stigmatizing. But I also wonder sometimes if it's actually being misused or encouraging people to kind of latch on to trauma as something that defines them. That's kind of what I worry about. And so I'm curious your thoughts about that.
No, I've definitely noticed a change in the use of the word across time. And so if you just think about it more clinically, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the manual that therapists, clinicians use to diagnose something like PTSD, they have very specific criterion for what is a traumatic event. And it involves learning of a death, being exposed to death. It involves a sense of a threat to your integrity, but not just a small threat, but a significant threat to your integrity as a human being. And you feel helpless, and there's something that's quite terrifying about the experience. And so there are some very specific things that define trauma in terms of that kind of diagnosis. ICD-9, which is the another diagnostic manual, they have a little bit broader definition of trauma. I like it because it's a little bit more inclusive for things like complex trauma, where people have multiple traumas across their lifetime. But again, we're talking about things even in that territory, like ongoing physical and sexual abuse, multiple traumas such as rape, assault, natural disaster, war, other kinds of things that meet the category of threat to life or integrity. And the way the word is being used now, I think sort of pulls away from that strong definition in this sense, where somebody might say something like, my mother took my phone away and it was traumatizing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's way on the other end of threat for life. And so it's getting used in ways that are about parents not doing what you want, or something happening that's emotionally painful but is not a trauma, like a divorce, let's say, which might be really emotionally painful but would not be categorized as a trauma. And then there's some gray territory, right? Like some forms of bullying for sure are traumatic, where other forms might not be called a trauma just based on these official definitions. And so you have to be thoughtful about it as a clinician. And I think one of the things that we should be thinking about when we're using the term is, what do we mean? Because I'm not going to do the same kind of interventions and treatments for somebody whose mom yelled at them, or dad yelled at them, or caregiver, or somebody who is experiencing a divorce, maybe because of an extramarital affair or something like that. I'm not going to do the same kind of targeted trauma exposure work with them that I would do with somebody who has the official definition of what a trauma is.
Yeah, no, that's helpful to think about that, right? Like that we as clinicians are flexible, and as people are going through their lives and things are hard in various ways and they have big emotions, maybe in response to lots of things, like how we address it really does depend on what they're going through. And what we're talking about today, maybe, different people would define it in different ways, but the word trauma, but we're talking more specifically about those major events that really, are kind of in that category of capital T trauma, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And it because the word gets used so often, I do worry that it dilutes what happens for people who really do experience a significant trauma. And even clinicians sometimes will refer to trauma in ways that really are not traumatic. No, that I don't say that to diminish in any way painful experiences, because clearly some people who are calling something traumatic can be incredibly painful, and even painful for a long period of time. But if we overuse the word, then we lose the meaning of it, if that makes sense. And so as someone who works in the field, I really want to keep the meaning of it. And because it has, I think, significance. When I'm referring to trauma, I'm helping people who their threat systems are turned on in ways that you don't see in these other forms of what sometimes people call trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in the course of that answer, you talked about, what trauma is, how you define it, at least in this context. You alluded to how sometimes there's like an acute one-time event trauma, and then there's also chronic or complex trauma. So there's all kinds of different variations of this. And one of your chapters in your book is about the fallout of trauma, kind of the long-term impact, and how there's both intra and interpersonal impacts or fallout of trauma. And PTSD clearly is one possible result of trauma. But could you speak a little bit to that? And I know you have a whole chapter about it, so people can dive in deeper in the book if they want to hear more. But just kind of in general, like what are some of the fallouts that we often see as a result of trauma?
Well, so if you have single or multiple events, let's say, but they're discrete multiple events, most people go through a natural recovery process. So if you're thinking about post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, so exposure is high. A fair percentage of the population is exposed to what I'm referring to as a traumatic event, but about 7 to 12% of the population actually get PTSD. So that's one of the more significant fallouts of the trauma. And PTSD is essentially an avoidance disorder. So what happens is the people get traumatized, and then the experience of the trauma seems to keep recurring. They get locked in. So they'll have fast heart rate, feelings of anxiety or panic, fears about the future, the trauma happening again, or intrusive memories about it coming in at times when they're not even thinking about it, just showing up. The classic sign of PTSD is nightmares. Mm-hmm. And so there's some really significant intra or internal experiences that people can have, and then they don't like them, they don't want them, so they start to do things like avoid, I'll call it running, hiding, and fighting, right? Where they are trying to get away from anything that reminds them of the trauma, or if they have internal sensation, they want them to stop negative sensations that they don't like or feel uncomfortable about. So they'll stay away from people, places, and things that trigger or evoke those kinds of experiences. And their life can be quite disrupted by the avoidance process, where their life gets smaller and smaller. It's almost like they can't go to work, or they don't want to leave the home. They don't want to be in public places. There's all different kinds of things that people will avoid as the result of a trauma that results in PTSD. Now, if you think about that on a continuum, then the fallout of the trauma could include all kinds of behaviors that are avoidance related, escaping the experience of the original trauma, whether it's an intrusive memory or a physiological sensation. But maybe they don't meet criteria for PTSD, but they're still having subclinical or quite negative experiences that are impacting their life in ways that are problematic. And if you think about complex trauma, which is essentially many traumas of different forms across a long period of time, and it's often characterized by inability to escape, meaning that it occurs in your home, so maybe physical or sexual abuse, or you're inside of a relationship where there's domestic violence that happens over a long period of time. So, and you can even get complex trauma from war experiences if you are exposed to a lot of trauma over time in war situations. So the thing that happens there, though, is that, which is just a little bit different from PTSD, is that it tends to impact relationships more negatively. Like people start having trouble with relationships. Emotional difficulties show up in a more prominent. They're struggling with their emotion. They feel like maybe they can't regulate, and it's impacting how they're reacting and responding to things that might not normally be distressing, but now are distressing. It impacts behavior, like the responses to triggers might be over exaggerated, even more so than like a startle response from PTSD. And so complex trauma has some interesting qualities to it that tend to have more impact across different domains in a person's life. Not that PTSD doesn't have a huge impact too. I mean, they're both pretty powerful, but one really impacts things more relationally, if that makes sense, than the other, where the person is really struggling to make relationships work. PTSD has that too. So again, there's this kind of continuum of responses, and people can have some symptoms while not others. And so I think it's really important for clinicians and people who have had a trauma to really look at how it might be impacting them and think about what their symptoms, I guess we'd call, might be.
Yeah, and how it's impacting their life. And as you said earlier, sometimes it is making their life, it's just getting in the way, I think, sometimes for people. And this is kind of the goal of the work, right? What is that it's getting in the way of living a full, rich, meaningful life that they want to live, when it's all about that trauma, or when it's all about trying to avoid or control the trauma. Yeah.
Well, and if you can imagine how something like avoidance gets rolling. So let's say that you were a victim of a sexual assault, and the person who assaulted you had brown hair and was wearing a red t-shirt. What can happen is that other people with brown hair and red t-shirts can trigger the experiences, and the color red itself can begin to trigger the experience. And so there's this spread of the triggers that happens through learning and relational experiencing, which is a bigger topic that we don't have time to get into. But it really can impact people's life, where things that were once not dangerous now take on features of danger because of the association that they have with trauma or threat, features of threat.
And one of the things that sort of comes up throughout the book is this idea of fear of fear. You know, we have that kind of fear response to trauma, which is our threat system, you know, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that kind of wired in threat system. And then that's part of what gets avoided, is those internal sensations and intrusive thoughts or memories and that type of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
So the way this thing really gets going is that the original trauma is so powerful that it sets your nervous system on high, and then you're more sensitive to things that are not dangerous, and suddenly things that weren't threatening are now threatening. And since we don't like the experience, like, it is no fun to walk around with your heart rate going and your threats, your hypervigilance up high, and you're looking for danger and waiting for something to happen around every corner. Like, that is a pretty unpleasant way to walk through life, or that your relationships never seem to stabilize and there's always fear in the relationship. So what happens is we're aware of these experiences, and then we get afraid of those experiences. So not only are we fearful about the original event, we're fearful about the experiences related to the original event. So that's the fear of fear ideas. Even having those experiences is a fearful experience. So it kind of cycles around on top of itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's like a loop diagram in your book illustrating this, right? That cycle of avoidance and control. Yeah. And similar with thoughts related to trauma, when people get they perseverate, they might have intrusive memories or something. And then often the response to that, which makes sense to a degree, is to try to just avoid or stop thinking about it. But I mean, I think people who are familiar with ACT will be well aware of the trap that is. But for people who aren't so familiar with ACT, what's the problem with that strategy? We'll just stop thinking about it, right?
Yeah. There's a terrible
Easy.
trap there.
Yeah.
Like there's a paradox just built in here where if you want to stop thinking about something, you have to know what it is that you want to stop thinking about. So there's an inherent paradox in the process, which is, I don't want to think about my trauma. Well, what trauma do you mean? The one I'm thinking about right now that I don't want to think about. So can you feel that very fast loop that's inside of it? So people will take pretty drastic measures to try to escape the thoughts of it and avoid the thoughts of it, which include things like excessive sleep or no sleep. If it's nightmares, they'll try to avoid sleep. Substance use, significant alcohol, or maybe other kinds of substances where people are trying to self-medicate or drown the intrusiveness just enough. And substance use is, in fact, quite highly correlated with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so people don't quite realize that the pattern of thinking is that if you really don't want to think about it, you have to check out in such a way that you either dissociate, you have to distract yourself continuously, which becomes a big problem in relationships and connections and stuff like that, or you have to drown it with alcohol or something like that in order to try not to have thoughts. And so with our approach, we're really working to help people relate to their thinking differently so that the thoughts themselves are not really a problem anymore, even if they occur and are unpleasant, no doubt. But the thoughts are not the same as the trauma itself. And the more you struggle with it, the more they're going to show up. So we're going to try to reduce that struggle in the service of some freedom from the intrusiveness of it.
So this is so important. And it's making me think of the interview that we're going to release, which is with someone who experienced trauma and then writes about it. Emmy Neatfeld, and she wrote a terrific book and memoir and has written articles about it. And she talked about how it was taking up 75% of her time to think about it and then try not to think about it until she used a therapy approach that kind of got her to face it. And I think that just hearing her lived experience of that is so poignant, just how consumed she was by it. And I think people who are really deep in PTSD, that it can kind of take over their thinking to such a degree.
That's why it feels like it becomes kind of an identity, right? Is because my whole life starts getting structured around avoiding the experience. But if you're actively avoiding something, that means you're continuously aware of what it is that you're avoiding.
Right.
And so you actually spend more time with the trauma, the memory of the trauma, than if you stop avoiding and let yourself just process the experience and come to a place where you can recognize that actually the trauma is not happening in this moment. And that includes all of the physiological sensations, body sensations that come along with it. I like to use this example of a client who was held at gunpoint and the end of the gun was pressed into her skin. And the main problem that she was struggling with was, I can't stop feeling the sensation of the gun being pressed into my skin. It just is with me all the time. And, nobody would want to have that kind of experience all the time. It's almost like being present to the trauma continuously. So she was trying all different kinds of things to get rid of the sensation, but nothing seemed to be working until we did some work where we were open and present and allowing, changing her relationship to the sensation, helping her to see that I can have this experience and not run, not avoid, not hide, and get my life back in not taking all those efforts. She still felt it and became aware of it from time to time, but it no longer had the power that it once had, which is exactly what we wanted for her.
That's a great example, right? The sensation of that is not the same thing as the gun, because I think it's so scary and terrifying and unpleasant that people it's as if.
It's as if.
Yes.
That's exactly right. It is happening again. And part of the work that we're doing is like to notice that your mind is saying that in the presence of the experiences that you're having physiologically or thought-wise, and to actually see that it's not happening. And when you do that kind of work, you essentially learn to stop the escape response, or another way to say that is inhibit avoidance.
So in this approach, one of the things that I think is unique about ACT is that it's really not about symptom reduction, right? You hear all these symptoms of PTSD or post-trauma, that people might be experiencing, and in ACT, that's not the goal. So what is the goal, Robyn? What are we aiming for here if it's not relief from these symptoms?
Yeah. Well, it's relief, but not by running away from yourself anymore. And so the relief comes in what you start to do differently in the world. And so our ultimate goal is values-based living and creating meaning in life. And part of what happens for people who are impacted by trauma in the ways that significantly impair their functioning is that they're often waiting for things to be different inside their skin, for things not to be scary. And when that gets better, then I'll live my life. I've had many people say to me, when my PTSD goes away, I'll finally have my life back. The problem is that I work with people who've been struggling with PTSD symptoms for years and years and years. And so life is kind of passing people by. And I want them to have their life back as quickly as possible and be living in meaningful and important ways here and now, instead of at some time in the future, in this unknown event that the symptoms are going to suddenly disappear. And so part of the way I think of it is that your body is built to respond to dangerous threats to your integrity, your well-being, your sense of being alive, right? Like we're designed to do that. And sometimes things just get kind of stuck. And the way to get unstuck isn't to say, I shouldn't feel these things anymore. It's to say, I feel these things and I'm not being traumatized. I don't have to run. Your body is no longer your enemy. Because if you're inside of that symptom profile, responding to your own experiences as if you are now the enemy, I can't have this fast heart rate. I can't feel that anxiety. I don't want to have those thoughts. Then your own experience, one that you can't undo, like we can't go back in time, we can't undo history. Your own body becomes your enemy, and we want to move away from that way of relating to yourself and into a way of having compassion for your experiencing, for noticing that your body was trying to take care of it you at one point and keep you alive, and reclaiming a way of living that isn't about struggling with yourself, but is about engaging in the world in ways that matter to you.
So one of the ways that you do this work of helping people, contact these thoughts and emotions and sensations and memories is through exposure work. And so can you give everyone a little primer on what do we mean? What is exposure work? And why is it often an important part of trauma treatment?
I am so grateful that you asked me this question, because there's so much misunderstanding about what exposure work is and what it's about. Even clinicians have wrong ideas about what it is and forget that its purpose. So exposure work is about encountering, facing, processing emotional and psychological experiences, physiological experiences, in such a way that you learn that your own experiencing is not a dangerous thing. So what that means is we have to visit those experiences or show up to them in some way. So we might do that through a number of different exercises, like maybe having you visit the memory of the trauma, or having you go to places where triggers are eliciting the experiences that you're avoiding. But it's not because we're trying to re-traumatize you, which is one of my least favorite terms in trauma work. We are not re-traumatizing people. Essentially what we mean by that is people's symptoms are getting kind of big or loud, and people get afraid of that. And what happens, though, if you actually process through it and stay with it, is the loudness goes down. But in this sense, you're no longer struggling with yourself. You're no longer in the avoidance fight. So exposure is designed to help us learn. It's not designed to make people suffer. That is not what it's about.
Yes, the conversation, anyone who wants to hear more about this, listen to my conversation with Emmy, because that was her original experience, is the therapist was afraid of re-traumatizing her. And I think it's scary for people sometimes, therapists and traumatized people alike, because it sounds so intense and it's hard, and it can be. And you're doing it for a reason. So I'm really glad you said that, right? And it's not done in this haphazard way. It's structured. It's done with care. Nobody's forcing anyone. I think you mentioned in the book that it's by choice.
Absolutely by choice. And well, as a person who has seen all kinds of trauma in the world, trauma that, and worked with clients who have told me stories that I would never share with anybody because they're so powerful and just devastating, really, where sometimes even I'm surprised by what human beings can do to other human beings. And people have a right to be afraid of these experiences. But I don't want to give people the idea that they're being re-traumatized by visiting these experiences. The trauma is not happening again with exposure. You're visiting a memory of the trauma. You're evoking some of the experiences that you had physiologically of the trauma. You're not traumatizing the client. Does that make sense? And so, yes, people are going to have powerful experiences, but it's for a very specific purpose. And that's about recovery. It's about you learning to gain control over how you move and work in the world by letting go of control of the fear of approaching these internal experiences that you're having. So I'm very respectful of clients, and it's absolutely their choice. And yes, it can be scary to think about revisiting a really painful trauma. So you want to do it with compassion and thoughtfulness and presence in a safe environment. And it can be one of the most powerful ways for people to recover.
Well, and there's a paradox, I think. This might bring back memories of Psych 101 back in the day for people who studied a little behavioral psychology and the psychology of learning around the goal isn't symptom reduction, but you're doing systematic desensitization by exposing the person to the fear and that all the things that are associated with it. And so even though the goal isn't symptom reduction, sometimes what happens with repeated exposure is that it kind of, over the time, it's not quite as intense, right? I mean, which I've seen that happen in the exposure work I've done before, and it's profound. I mean, it can really, and I'm sure, Robyn, you've been doing PTSD work for so long, you've seen that too, right?
Well, for sure. Like there's a habituation process, basically, where it's like if you're afraid of a dog and you keep sitting next to dogs and petting dogs and getting in front of dogs, dogs become less scary. most of the time, right? This is why the new learning is so important and why habituation is not sufficient or may only be part of the process, is that our responses are context dependent. So you could very well learn to be in the presence of a dog, if I use that as an example. And by the way, I have worked with people who've been attacked by dogs and have been traumatized by it, right? But if you're in the presence of a dog, you might do very well after you've gone through an exposure. However, in a different context, an unfamiliar context, let's say, the presence of a dog might reignite the fear. And so I don't know if you've ever experienced something like this where you have been a little afraid of something, you're around it a lot, and then you move away from it for a while, and then you're afraid again. Mm-hmm. I'll use a personal example. Sometimes when I go on vacation, if I get to be in the ocean, and I get to go in the ocean a lot, I'm like, this is great, I love it, and I'm not too worried about what's floating underneath me. And, especially if I keep jumping in and going in the water and doing lots of snorkeling or something like that. But then I go away and I don't do it for 3 years. Guess what happens when I go back to the ocean? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What's in the water? I'm all afraid again, right? And so we have to remember that we're designed to respond when things are a little spooky or scary, and especially if they're threatening. So when I go back in the water after years of being away from it, let's say, I inhibit the avoidance response because my anxiety goes up and, I don't want to get in the water. So I'm avoiding the thing that I love to do if I let that fear be in charge. But if I inhibit that, if I say, nope, I can feel it, I'm afraid, but I'm going to get in the water anyway, then I'm back in it. I've inhibited the avoidance and I'm back in a place where I'm doing something joyful for me. And, I'm swimming in the water, so to speak, if that's a good example anyway.
That's a great example. I was actually as you were talking about that, I was thinking of people getting back out into social situations after COVID lockdown and how at first it was kind of weird and scary, but then the alternative is to be isolated, but you do it and you kind of get back into your groove, but it takes that initial, period of feeling awkward or a little scared or anxious, social anxiety, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
But if you do it, what happens is you start to get a sense of self-efficacy.
Yeah.
And you learn that, I can do this. Even though my system is aroused, I can engage. By the way, doing this kind of work too doesn't mean that you won't respond appropriately in another threat situation. You still do.
Yes.
This gives you more choice over situations that are non-threat. Where if you're holding back in your life because you're having a physiological response or you're afraid of something's going to happen in the future, then your life is not your own. And it's sort of dictated by fear of something that happened in your past. And so this work that we're doing in You Are More Than Your Trauma is about finding ways to get your life back, really to own your life again in ways that not only are about stopping the avoidance, but maybe are even about growth and enhancing your life experience.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people do think, well, if I let my guard down, I won't be prepared. That's one of the reasons people sometimes are a little resistant to do this. And I think your point is a good one, that it doesn't mean that you won't be able to respond in future situations. But if you're just so tuned into that all the time, what else are you missing that's happening?
Yeah.
And you also write in the book, I love this quote, exposure is not white knuckling your way through memories.
Yeah. So sometimes when you're doing exposure, people are like bracing for the pain, right? And their whole body is tensed up and it's almost as if they're trying not to have the experience while having the experience. And so they don't really get to process it. And so part of the work here is if you think about what happens emotionally, physiologically, and with our thoughts, they're all on the move. Everything's rising and falling. Like one of the things that's always fascinated me that we don't pay that much attention to, because we can't imagine it, I don't think, is how much movement is going on in our body at any one time. Like, let's just contact a couple of pieces of movement. Your heart beating, your blood flowing, your cells digesting, nerves firing, mitochondria run around inside of cells, electrons spinning. Like, can you see? Like, how, like, we're not even
Mitosis, meiosis. Now I'm going back to Bio 101.
all of those things are happening, right? But we're not aware of it. We're not contacting it. But it is massive. Like, it's almost, I compare it sometimes to thinking about all the movement that's happening in the universe. You know, like we think of our sun just sort of sitting still out there with little planets rolling around it, but that's not what's happening. Our sun is hurling through the universe, and our galaxy is hurling through the universe, and we're all, like movement is such a huge part of what it means to be alive. And the other thing that moves are thoughts, feelings, and sensations. They rise and fall. They come and go unless you're standing against them. If you are your own enemy, then you've got to fight some, and it makes it more present. But if you allow the flow, if you allow the rise and fall, the sensations to come and go, then you start to process and digest and see the movement. And in that circumstance, all of those experiences are far less threatening and less capturing. So you have more freedom. And we, in this book, like, we want to move people towards freedom and choice so that these experiences, even if they rise, it'll be recognized that they will fall and that you can keep stepping forward in your life in meaningful ways. Not that it'll always be easy. Like, we get that there are situations and circumstances where you might be heavily triggered, or the context is just right so that things are not feeling so great and some of the memories come back. And we want to provide you a way to recover from that much more quickly and to not again fall into the trap of static non-movement where you're stuck again.
Well, to continue on a little bit more about exposure, you mentioned that there's a number of different ways that you can do exposure, and there's a number of behavioral treatments that have an exposure component. And in the book, you draw from written exposure therapy, and you include a actual exercise that people can do. Well, it's more than an exercise, actually. You have basically a kind of a protocol that people can use to do exposure work and to use writing, which I really have been doing more and more of that type of work in my practice with trauma, the written exposure therapy. Again, it blows me away how much it can be profound. So would you talk about what written exposure therapy is and just the gist of how it works and what that process is like for people?
Sure. So let me just make a couple of comments prior to that.
Okay.
One is we don't move people or all people right into the written exposure or the exposure part. Sometimes people need to build other skills. And the first, like grounding skills, I'm here now and okay. I'm in touch with my body being here. I'm not there and then, I'm here and now. We might do other kinds of skills like mindfully observing, thinking, like things that sort of prepare you to do the exposure work. So we do some of that in the book prior to the exposure. That said, so we're following Judith Herman's 3-stage approach, right? Stage 1 is safety and stabilization. Stage 2 is exposure. And stage 3 is like recovery and growth. So when we get to the exposure, people are generally prepared for it. And there are a number of ways to do exposure, 2 ways, in vivo and imaginally. And so in vivo exposure means we're going to have you go out in the environment and go to places that you've been avoiding. You're exposing to a crowd. You're staying at the family barbecue. You're getting on the airplane. Those are all in vivo experiences. Imaginal means that you're processing it in your imagination. And that's what written exposure is. It's based on some of the work by Pennebaker, who looked at what happens if you do writing of trauma versus other kinds of experiences. And he was discovering that it was helping people. And so there's a few other folks who've really done some research on it and dug in a bit more. Brian Marks and Denise Sloan have actually written a book called Written Exposure Therapy that uses a writing imaginal exposure process. And we're doing something like that in our book, although it doesn't follow that protocol, where we are inviting people to revisit the memory of a trauma imaginally and to write about it as they're revisiting it. So they're doing an imaginal exposure, that is, they're showing up to the traumatic event, and we're inviting them to write about their thoughts, feelings, and sensations of that event. And that is a way of processing it and being present to it. And we want them to be in touch with their body so that they're also talking about physiological sensations, because that's such a huge part of what people experience in trauma. We want them to be in touch with their emotions. Even if they're terrified, they can write, I was terrified. It was terrifying to me. And their thoughts. I thought I was going to die. I thought I wasn't going to make it. But we're getting people to imaginally be with all of those experiences while writing as a way to process through the trauma, confront the experience, and learn that it's not going to harm you, that these experiences are not threatening. They look threatening, and your mind will make them sound threatening. But you'll also learn that that's your mind doing that as well, and that you're not currently in the midst of a trauma. They can be powerful emotional experiences, and it's a really good intervention. I'm quite pleased with it myself. People can do it, learn to do it on their own, and as they do it, if they confront situations that are difficult in the future that remind them of a trauma, they can do another writing and help them get back into a place of recovery. So I quite like the intervention. And that's what we have them do in the book. But we put a lot of scaffolding around it so that people are prepared to do it. And they also have the choice. They have a choice.
They have a choice, yeah. And what I really appreciate about the book is that it is very structured. It's very clear what you're supposed to do. So it gives people that structure, those guardrails for how to do it. But it really is capturing the important parts of doing exposure therapy for trauma. But people can do it on their own, but in a way that is therapeutically useful.
Absolutely.
And it might be, because I'm just thinking, if you're trying to do it on your own, but you don't have that kind of structure, it could be all over the place, or it could actually be maybe just done in a way that's not going to actually be very helpful. But even that guidance, like really tapping into the sensory parts of it. And in the book, I mean, you go into great detail, kind of walking people through the steps. Because I've done written exposure therapy, that book that you mentioned earlier, as a therapist, and I've followed it, but I've never seen actually a version of it that people can do on their own in this particular way.
Yeah. And I've seen this work again and again and again for folks. And the nice part about the way the book is structured that is, even if you just work through stage 1 and you skip the stage 2, the exposure part, and go on to stage 3, because that's 2 chapters in the book, right? You still can benefit from all that's in there. So acceptance and commitment therapy, I think, really does help people open up, be aware, and engage in their lives in important ways. If you're going to do trauma treatment, in my humble opinion, you got to work in exposure to the trauma, not just exposure in general, because that's where people are really stuck, right? And they just need to be able to process that memory. They can benefit from the other stuff as well, but adding in that exposure just can move people forward by leaps and bounds
And I like the flexibility with this because sometimes people, like you said, it's a choice. And sometimes people may want to start with some of these other skills. They may think, well, I might do the exposure work at some point, but I don't want to do that right now. There's too much going on in my life. Or some people might want to dive right in, but there is a flexibility to it that I appreciate. So, okay, we're not going to do that. Let's work on some of these other skills. And that third pillar that you're talking about is about kind of moving forward, right? And the last few chapters of your book are about things like resilience, growth beyond trauma, sort of those ongoing obstacles that will come up. And maybe to close us out today, could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like from an ACT perspective? What do sort of resilience and recovery and long-term healing look like with this model?
You bet. Well, so one of the things that Darren and I recognize and want to be heartfelt about is that life contains suffering. And we recognize that even though people go through treatment and learn these skills, they're going to be faced with very painful times in their future. And so in the latter part of the book, we want to help them engage skills that are going to help them deal with future points of pain and not fall back so easily into a trauma-based responding. And we think with the model of values-based living that not only can you recover and start to live as a person who experienced a trauma at some point in their life and now has, as we said earlier, a rich and textured life, but that you might even be able to do things as you move forward that grow your vitality and that you find incredibly meaningful for you as you step forward. And so we have a piece in there about compassion for the self, a piece about how to stay connected when there's setbacks. We talk about resilience being that ability to kind of bounce back more quickly when you do meet stumbling blocks in the road. Recovery is a process, not an outcome. So it's not like you're recovered and you're done. Life just doesn't work that way. It'd be nice, I guess, if it did, but all of us have more losses to confront in our lifetimes, and pain is a part of joy and vice versa. So we want to make room for both of those experiences and not have people just live in the pain of trauma, but also experience the joy of engagement and grow and movement forward. And so those last chapters are about creating something like that. Like, I know there's going to be pain, but I am going to make room for joy. One of the things that we've learned is if you're not willing to have pain, if you're pushing against pain, you are also pushing against joy. We're not very good at getting rid of one emotion or suppressing one emotion or avoiding one experience like anxiety. We kind of have to shut it all off in order to avoid those experiences. Not very successfully, I might add.
Right.
Because you just have to stay shut off in order to do it. And we cut ourselves off from joy in that process. And so part of what we're inviting people to do is to let the experience of suffering in the world be seen as part of what it means to be here and alive, not consuming, not overtaking, but part of, and that it allows us a place where joy, if we open up to that experience, where joy will be fully available as well. And we really want that for people. We want them to have joy as well.
Oh, well, that is a beautiful note to end on. It kind of brings us back full circle to that idea of expansiveness and you are more than your trauma. And I think that's what it's all about. And kind of people, I think, got a sense of what the journey of your book is like, just kind of going through these processes and coming out the other side with more meaning and vitality. So people who are interested, you can link to the book on our show notes for today, and you can find Robyn online. We'll link to everything. And I really hope that people, therapists and people who just want to know more about trauma and anyone who's experienced trauma will consider taking a look at the book because it's very It's a beautiful book. It's really well done. And so grateful, Robyn, that you came back on for the 7th time to talk to us about it.
Me too. Yeah, no, that's really fantastic. I hope that we can do another one again sometime if you guys don't get bored of me.
Oh, never. Well, that's the big mystery, though, is when will she come on for episode 8 and what will the topic be? No one knows. Maybe we'll set up a pool for our listeners.
Yeah, a little betting pool or something like that. Well, if I can weigh in on that bet, I bet I will be happy to do it again.
Oh, thanks, Robyn. Well, we always love to have you on the show, and thank you so much. It was great to see you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that was part 1 of my PTSD series with Robyn Walser. And I am here with Jill, who has done lots of trauma work and exposure work in her career, to talk about the conversation. Jill, over to you.
Well, I loved this. And I love this idea you had, Debbie, of doing these back-to-back episodes. And I think this is just perfect that our listeners can get like a really good, solid understanding of what exposure therapy for PTSD looks like. And then they're going to get to listen to Emmy talk about her personal experience with it, and debunking a number of myths, which I think is so important. In the upcoming episode with Emmy, you talk about the book, The Body Keeps the Score, that Bessel van der Kolk wrote, that has been, a New York Times bestseller forever. And there's a lot of misinformation in there, part of which is that like exposure doesn't work and exposure is re-traumatizing, and it's all BS. And it means lots of people don't get access to this incredibly powerful treatment. And so I have been doing primarily exposure therapy. I mean, I do primarily ACT, but part of ACT is actually exposure therapy, which not everyone knows. And I think one of the things that was really impactful for me as a therapist that I hope our therapists who are listening will get something out of if they haven't done exposure themselves yet, is when I was a little baby therapist in my very first practicum, I was on a PTSD unit. And so I was doing prolonged exposure with a woman who had been raped as a teenager, and she was in her 50s and still had severe PTSD. And so we were doing the retelling of the trauma. And my supervisor checked in with me at the end of our very first exposure session. And I said, yeah, I'm good. I'm fine. And it was a Friday and I went home and I didn't process it with her. We didn't really talk about it. And then I really struggled all weekend, where I was actually having intrusive images of the story that my client had told me. And I went back on Monday and I told my supervisor, and she was incredible. We processed everything. And ultimately, to keep a long story short, what ended up happening, and I think this is the part that's so cool and important, is as we continued to do this work together, my client habituated and learned that while what happened to her was dangerous, the memories of it, the story of it are not. And so she got better over time. But guess what? Same thing happened to me. So even though, yes, it was intense, the story was hard to listen to as a woman, but as I continued to listen over and over, I habituated and I had the same experience of, this is just words. This is just a story. This is just a memory. And it is not dangerous and I am safe and okay. And so it was this really cool, like parallel process that we both went through. And then it made it so that for the rest of my career, I mean, I'm 20, 25 years in at this point, I love doing prolonged exposure. And yes, the stories are intense, but to see the way clients come out on the other side is just the most rewarding thing. And the stories lose their potency as a result of the exposure. And so it is just, I mean, I can't say enough good things about it. So if we have listeners who have PTSD or other kinds of phobic disorders, who have never tried exposure therapy, I just highly recommend it.
I really appreciate you sharing that experience, because I think, as therapists, we hold a lot of big feelings, and we hear stories. And I can still remember some of the stories I heard early on when I first started working with trauma. And I mean, these stories can be intense and upsetting.
Yes, they can be intense and upsetting. And then don't they get less intense and upsetting for you too over time?
Exactly. They
right?
do.
Yeah.
And also when I have clients now who have trauma, and I know they have trauma and they know they have trauma, and I suggest maybe they want to, work on it, process the trauma, do some exposure work, and they choose not to, and that's their right. I'm not going to force anyone to. I just feel this sense of avoidance. And I feel this feeling of like, I could help you if we can talk about it.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's interesting because I don't want to push it, but I will sometimes encourage it because I think it feels unsatisfying to me now to know that it's there and it's affecting them and it's being avoided.
And this is why I love these 2 episodes so much, because I think a lot of times the reason clients are saying, oh, no, I don't want to do exposure is because they've either read The Body Keeps a Score, or they've been to a therapist who has said, oh, you shouldn't talk about it. It's too upsetting, which is what happened with Emmy, which people will hear when they listen to the part 2. And that basically they're basing that around a misunderstanding that it's going to be awful and unbearable and re-traumatizing. And that's just simply false. Yes, it can be hard and intense, but the hard and intense goes down relatively quickly.
Yes.
And you get to feel totally empowered because you have taken back control over your memories instead of the memories controlling you.
Yeah, it frees you up. There's a freedom to it. Yes.
And so I really hope that these 2 episodes reach people so they realize they can do this and it can be super, super helpful.
Yes. Well, thanks for listening, everyone, and stay tuned for part 2.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.